Liam and Noah had been friends almost since kindergarten. The two mischievous and lively boys went almost everywhere together. Over the years, they even became similar to each other in their habits, interests, and desires. When the boys graduated from high school, their wealthy parents tried to interest them in something and gave them a business. But a gift is never as expensive as something honestly suffered and earned. The boys loved to have fun and spent a great deal of money on it. The young guys thought of themselves as cool businessmen because of their exhilarating youthful temperament. The main goal in all business meetings and office events was to have fun. Each time they tried to surprise their employees with new, unprecedented entertainment. It should be noted that even if it was to the detriment of reputation or finances, all was forgiven. They tried to turn any corporate event not just into a show, but also into a party full of shocking surprises. For example, inviting rock musicians who had received rather unflattering fame for their performances was quite their style. But the whole staff appreciated the organizers' creativity. The guys really liked the enthusiastic praise of their subordinates after such creative parties. This time, they decided to organize another corporate party to which Chinese partners had been invited. "Let's go and have some fun," Liam suggested, "and at the same time, think about how to surprise our Chinese man." Noah had never been against such suggestions, and he was already imagining how they would party in some club. Besides, he understood that communication with partners in a relaxed atmosphere was sure to yield good results. He answered Liam with a slight chuckle. "Who would mind, but not me. Let's give them something to drink, make a surprise, or better yet, something special, and they're ours." This variant of making deals might be acceptable to local businessmen, but they are representatives of a completely different country. The dashing guys didn't think of that. After getting into the car, they went to the Ember Club. The name, by the way, had something common with the menu. Almost all the food was cooked on the charcoal by a shapely dark-skinned female dancer, the club's trademark. The car raced down the street, rumbling incendiary music from the open windows of the cabin, setting the guys up for a wonderful evening. Suddenly Noah yelled, shouting over the bass, "Stop! Brake! I said!" Liam was taken aback, but parked by a trash cans. As soon as the car engine died down, Noah almost whispered, with some kind of gleam in his eyes that Liam did not yet understand. "Think about it. If this one," he poked at the homeless man by the dumpster, "will come to our corporate party." Without waiting to his friend's reaction, he jumped out of the car and headed for the beggar. It was physically impossible to imagine this gentleman at a big corporate party with Chinese people and a lot of fancy tables and fancy outfits. An old man was sitting on a dirty, spoiled cardboard table, begging for money from passers-by, with his hat or cap outstretched. He was dressed in old clothes, or rather, it would be better to call them rags, from which a long unwashed body could be seen in great number of holes. He wore enormous, completely torn boots on his feet. It was not even clear how they held together. It was as if the soles existed separately from the tops. The old man, trying every minute to look into the eyes of passers-by, quietly said, "Thank you very much, God bless you. It's not for me. My friend does need it." Someone even came up and put money down in his cap. If you looked closely, you could see about 10 coins and a couple of paper bills. Noah, without approaching the old man, as if aiming for a volleyball hoop, threw a handful of coins into his cap. When he hit the exact target, he clapped himself cheerfully on the knee and turning to the car, continued, "Can you imagine the shock if such a scarecrow appears among us?" Liam, without even thinking about it, understood and accepted his friend's idea. Getting out of the car, he went to the old man. "Listen, buddy, there is an opportunity to eat and drink and earn money," he began, turning to the homeless man. "Your task is to come to our office today, to the party. Let's say, as a guest artist, and to shock our pious audience, shaking your rags here and there." Noah supported the conversation. "Come on, old man. You don't even have to do anything. And then you don't have to go to your job for 2 days." He was pleased with this joke and laughed loudly. The old man looked at them in silence, leaned on the trash, slowly got up, and, with a bitter sigh, began to walk away. After a couple of minutes, the car came up alongside him, and Noah, throwing his cart, shouted, "Hey, you should not refuse such a pleasure. Think about it. Put on your elegant rags and go have fun." The car sped off the street with a great speed, and the beggar sank as if he had collapsed on a bench beside the road. He sat for a long time with his head down, as if he were immersed in a world only he knew. Tears streamed down the old man's cheek, and a nervous chill ran down his spine. He knew perfectly well that it was a shame to live like this and beg, but there was nothing he could do about it. After all, he really did not need the money, but his friend, the only loyal and faithful creature whom he had found as a blind puppy near the same garbage cans. The dog was not only his friend, but also his family. One day, when he returned to the small abandoned outhouse where they lived together, the old man suspected something was wrong. The dog was laying there, barely moving and barely breathing. Most likely Sparky, that was the dog's name, was poisoned. There are a lot of good people who try to poison street dogs. Sick Sparky needed medications, so the old man had to go begging. He was almost used to wandering and living on the streets, and even knew where and when get the food. But sitting with his hand outstretched was quite unbearable for him. He thought over it and decided to agree to the guy's offer, for the sake of Sparky. After all, they had promised to pay the man, and he really needed the money now. He found more or less appropriate pants, and a shirt that were at least clean and without holes, and went to the party. The hall was beautifully decorated with balloons and loud music. There were a huge number of tables, full of all kinds of snacks, fruit, and alcohol. The old man had not seen so many delicacies in a long time. There were expensive cuts of meat and seafood, which he had once loved so much, all sorts of canapes, and rolls lay in variegated colors on the tables. The smell of roasted meat wafted from the kitchen, creating an even greater appetite. The men were all in formal suits, the ladies in fancy dresses and gleaming jewelry. The two boys he'd seen today and the ever-smiling Chinese partners sat at a separate table. As much as Liam and Noah hoped to get the Asians drunk, they didn't even touch the alcohol. They just sat there and babbled on without stopping in their language. An interpreter was not invited to the party, because the guests could speak English just as much as they needed. But meanwhile, they were talking to each other with a smile on their faces. Our guys could not understand anything in this conversation. The appearance of the homeless man really caused a furor. There was a burst of laughter after a moment of silence as he entered the hall. The Chinese too blurred into their oriental smiles. The tramp, taking his time, walked past the table with the guests. When he came up to the Chinese, he stood for a few minutes, turned around, and said something to them quickly in pure Chinese. There was a silence in the room, and our tough businessmen almost swallowed the shot glasses they had brought to their mouths at that moment. As for the Chinese companions, they changed their faces after his words, and sharply rose and retreated from the hall. Liam and Noah realized that the negotiations were broken. Noah was the first to jump up to the old man, grabbing him by his dirty collar and hissing, "What have you done? What kind of Chinese expert are you? What did you say to them?" The beggar gently moved his hand away, straightened his clothes, and tearfully answered, "I was only trying to stand up for you, and told them not to hurt you. It is not right, seeing that you are young and inexperienced, to drag you into their net of intrigue." After hesitating a little, he added, "You have to be more careful with the Oriental people." Liam approached him and asked where he got his knowledge of Chinese from. The old man thought for a minute and then began to talk. Once upon a time, Professor Joseph Perry, as his name turned out, taught Oriental languages at one of the universities. He had a beautiful family, a wife, and a daughter. Everything was going great until his beloved wife passed away from a long illness. It was better to have a daughter by his side, but she had followed her husband to his new place of work, thousands of miles away from home. It was very hard to live alone, because he and his wife had lived together in harmony for more than 30 years, and the loneliness weighed heavily on him. One day, his grandson came to visit him. Almost from the doorway, he said, "Wow, Grandpa, you live well alone in such an apartment. Life is not eternal. Let's think about it in advance." He began to walk around the old man's apartment. Looking into the drawers and cabinets, he turned to the grandfather and continued, "I'm the only grandson, so let's sign the place over to me at once. It will not change anything for you. Go on living, and I will be at peace as I'm going to have an apartment." They had not seen each other for many years, and Professor Perry was greatly surprised to see how cunning and insolent the boy had become. He realized late that the boy was an inveterate gambler, and one day he lost heavily. The sum was unthinkable, and when the boy was passed by the creditors, he did not hesitate to offer to take his grandfather's apartment, which he had already got his hands on, as repayment. It was the norm at the time to hire a huge muscle man with heavy gold chains around their massive necks to collect such debts. Clearly, they used to be in a jail in the past, so they stopped at nothing. The grandfather saw such guests one day on the doorstep of his apartment. When he opened the door, he saw three big fellows, all in the same sweatpants and leather jackets. The jocks quickly and sharply explained to him what would happen if he did not leave the shack in half an hour and give them the keys. They did not even let him pack properly. Although there was no need to take his things, going to live nowhere on the streets. The bandits warned him at once that if he went to the cops, both he and his grandson would go on living painfully and fearfully. Since then, the old man became homeless, and as crowds of similar people, he looked for somewhere to keep warm, sleep, or eat. During the warm season, it was alright. During the day, it was possible to sleep somewhere in the shade of trees. The worst was in winter. Basements and attics of houses was getting locked up from people like him, chasing people out of their entrances, or installing intercoms. Salvation was in an abandoned building, where there was still some glass. That's how the old man found shelter on the top floor of a crumbling house. The window was half broken, but the old man sealed up the window with the plywood he found, and the small room with the wooden floors became warm enough. The young businessman's mood changed greatly after this story. They felt sad and sorry for the old man. At this point, Lime and Noah were determined to help Professor Perry, no matter what the cost. It was no longer an amusement, but quite a sincere desire. The very next morning, the old man's salvation machine was launched. The legal department of the company engaged in judicial issues to return the old man's home, and successfully returned the apartment. Professor Perry was restored to the status of the sole owner. The best veterinarians were brought in to treat Sparky, and expensive medications were used. Soon the dog was happily wagging his tail, recognizing his rescuers. The grandson was sent to a clinic for treatment for alcohol and gambling addiction. Most importantly, the young man appreciated Mr. Perry's knowledge and experience in Oriental cultures and appointed him as a consulting translator. Today, seeing the formerly homeless man, it would be impossible to recognize him. The fit, cleanly and neatly dressed gentleman learned the subtleties and peculiarities of Eastern people.